We are this is going to be my soils lecture, and I'm actually going to break this into a couple of parts. So let's talk for just a few minutes about two things with soil. The first one is, make sure I'm on, soil formation. Make sure I can get this done. Okay. So there we go, soil formation. What soil formation actually means is that we are going from rock to soil, right? So when we go from rock to soil, there's a couple of different ways in which this happens. The big thing is weathering, right? So weathering is the term that we need for going from rock to soil, weathering. This can happen in three different ways. The first one is mechanical weathering. Okay. And the next one is chemical weathering. Oops. Chemical. And finally, we have biological. Okay, so the first thing, mechanical, it can happen in one of about three different ways. The first one is water. So water is a powerful weathering tool. It can move rock very easily and very quickly. If you've ever been in a place where there's been a deluge of water, you've seen rocks can actually just tumble. And so water is a good one for just washing things away. Another one is wind. So wind is an excellent mechanical weatherer. And the final one is friction. Now, usually those work all in conjunction with each other. So friction is rock hitting upon rock. If we were here doing a lab, we would look at how water can actually work together with the grinding of rock together to create soil. So it starts to break the rock down into tiny, tiny pieces. Okay, so water, wind, and friction are the big ones with mechanical weathering. There's another one called freeze-thaw. And what happens here is that the rock itself freezes really hard and then it thaws, and when it does, it starts to break into pieces. So that's freeze-thaw. Chemical, so this one can either happen with acids or it can happen with corrosives. And corrosives are just basically another way of saying our bases. So acids or corrosives can both begin to break rock down into soil. Biologic, now this can happen in a couple of different ways. One, it can be both chemical, and this comes from plants being able to produce weak acids. So they can actually produce weak acids. And the big one here to remember is lichens. So if you've ever walked around and seen a rock covered in usually gray, green, sometimes orangey or black, those are living things on top of the rocks. And so these lichens can actually grab hold of the rock and then start to secrete an acid that begins to break those rocks apart. And we talked about this when we talked about ecological succession. The other one is mechanical. So plants can actually break apart rocks mechanically, and they can do this through plant roots. So if you've ever been out, sometimes you'll see a rock. Let me just go ahead and let's put a little picture down here so you can remember what it looks like. So we have our rock out here, right? And then we might have a tree on top of it. So we got our little tree growing. Put some greenery on top of there. And it also then has these roots that can reach down, and what they're doing is they will look for crevices within the rock, and then they can begin to split it apart. So a tree can actually, over time, split a giant boulder apart. Now they can do it with little tiny roots that can dig down into the rock, but they can also use the roots as they get bigger to force their way and to force cracks into happening. So biological is both chemical and mechanical in weathering. Okay, so the process happens like this. So we start with, let me change back. I like that purple. All right, so we start with rock. So we've looked already at our different kinds of rock. We have igneous, and we have sedimentary, and metamorphic. Now, of those three rocks, the one that is probably the softest, generally speaking, is sedimentary. So these are sandstones, limestones, other things that are layer upon layer upon layer that have washed down. And when they do, they form this rock, and usually those can break down pretty easily into different kinds of soils. But all three of those can actually do that. So we have, over time, soil developing. Well, how does it happen? The rock is actually, each one of these are composed of things called minerals. So minerals are essentially the bits and pieces that form the rock itself. So depending upon what kind of elements are present, you're going to have different kinds of minerals. And two of the big ones that I just want to touch on, one is called quartz. Okay, quartz is usually like a calcium kind of rock, or it's got a lot of carbon to it. So quartz is one. And then the other one is called feldspar. And feldspar also has a lot of different kinds of elements to it, and it's just a pretty general type of mineral. Now, each one of these can break down into various kinds of soils. So over time, as the weathering happens, they're going to break down further and further into soil. And one that comes quite frequently from quartz is sand. So quartz is usually kind of hard, and so over time it's going to break down into sand. A common one that comes from feldspar is clay. So we have sand and clay, and then there's silt that's in between. All right, now these soils actually can be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces even still, and that is they can form their ionic forms. So from the ionic forms, we can get things like our potassium, our phosphorus. All of those can come from the breakdown of soil itself, our calcium and magnesium as well. So each one of those can be present in their ionic form within the soil. Okay, so we've talked about our weathering process. The other thing that affects soil is erosion. Let's change our little color here. Let's go with a dark blue. All right, so erosion. Now, erosion is different because what erosion is the movement of soil. So we're taking the soil that we've made or that has been made, and we're moving it from one place to the other. Now, it can come kind of through the same processes as our building of rock, and two of the big ones that move soil around are water and wind. Now, most of the time, the one we want to avoid is erosion. Erosion is usually not a good thing. Weathering, not so bad. It takes longer, obviously, and then erosion is a much quicker process, right? And it can occur through storms. Heavy winds, heavy rain usually do the most damage with erosion. And now there's also another thing that usually comes up, and that is compaction. So we have erosion, which is our moving. Compaction is where the soil becomes harder. So it's soil hardening. Now, compaction can happen in several different ways, and it's usually something we want to avoid as well. So we want to avoid erosion. We also want to avoid compaction. One of the big one is heavy machinery. Oops. So things like tractors. Let me write this down. Heavy machinery. Tractors. Cars. Trucks, those kinds of things. Another one is can be caused by animals. So animals can actually practice a lot of compaction. We do this, right? So if you've ever been out and seen someone started a shortcut across the grass, right? And what they do is they start a path, and over time, more people follow behind, right? And so eventually those animals or people will form this trail that cuts through. And what happens then is that no plants can grow on top of it. It can take years and years and years for that compaction to go away. There are several famous roadways that crisscross the United States and other places that were formed when animals started to walk across them. So there's one in Texas called the El Camino Real. And the El Camino Real is the King's Highway. It was a path that went across from east to west and ends up in Mexico. It started as a cattle trail, or essentially buffalo started to walk across and they formed their own trail. And then humans followed right behind. And eventually wagons followed behind there, and then eventually cars, and then we paved it. So that's just another kind of example of what compaction can do. It takes a long time for that to go away. All right, let's talk a little bit about soil profile and what that means. So a soil profile essentially is, let me change here, get a brown. A soil profile is what the soil looks like in layers, all right? So it all starts with rock. Let's go back. I don't like that brown after all. We're going to go with a gray. So let's say that you have a rock that forms down below. So this is our soil profile. Okay, and we start with bedrock. So let's say we have a rock up underneath here, bedrock. So it's hard. This would be like our igneous rock, our metamorphic, whatever it is. So this is bedrock. And this is also known as parent rock. So whatever parent rock you have, that determines the kind of soil that you're going to have above it. So whatever rock is underneath, whether it be limestone or shale or siltstone or all of those things that you looked at in the rock cycle, that actually can make up our bedrock. Okay, and this is known as the C layer. All right, so C layer is our bedrock. Above that is our B layer, and what starts to happen here is the rock starts to break apart into chunks. All right, so we're going to have our chunks here. You're still going to have a lot of rock up underneath, but you're also going to have mixed into it some of the soil begin to form. So now we'll go back to our brown. Let's go with this color. So the soil will start to form around the rock itself, just like this. And this is our B layer. And what this does then, this is because of weathering that this starts to happen. So you still have your big parent rock, right? So you have, let's go back. Oops. So we'd have our parent rock in here, right? But in between those are going to be your soil starting to form. All right, so I'm trying to make it look pretty. So there's our B layer right there. Lots of parent rock still left. Okay, On top of that is our A layer. All right. An A layer essentially is our topsoil. So let's make it, we're going to just go ahead and draw this in. So lots and lots of topsoil here. So this is mostly the soil, okay, that we've had formed right here. And this is the A layer. Now, also known as topsoil, right? Now, in this is all kinds of things, right? So this is the productivity part of the soil. This is where you're going to find lots of productivity. In other words, how do we want things to grow? We're going to need a lot of topsoil, okay? A lot of this A layer. Above it, we're going to have our final layer, which is our O layer. So we have our O up here. And the O is basically, it's going to ride right on top. Let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. The O stands for the organic. Essentially what this is dead plant matter, right? And animal matter. That makes up your O layer. Now sitting above that then is our plants. So we're going to have like our grasses growing up here. We would have trees and so forth. So that's the stuff that's on top, right? We have our stuff growing up here on top. But reaching down below, we have our roots that penetrate through, right? So we're going to have roots that come through here like this. And these serve very, very useful purposes. Some of them are going to be big and fat, like if you had a potato or a radish or whatever growing up underneath it. And so what this starts to do is it starts to break the soil apart. Just like the plants could break the rock apart, they also can loosen up the soil in the A layer. It also adds to the richness of it. So our prairies have very thick A layers, and the reason is because those roots go way down, and they can penetrate pretty deeply into the soil, and this starts to add organics to that A layer, which then increases the productivity of that layer. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I needed to say on that particular one. Oh yeah. Okay, so along with this, so that's our general soil profile, and you guys did that. Let's talk about what these different layers and where you're going to find them and what they all mean. So to start with, we're going to see that in places where you have little to no O layer, these are going to be in places where you pretty much have very little precipitation. So that would be places like the tundra and the desert. Now, not only do they have very little precipitation, they also, that should say very little. They're also going to have few plants, right? Few plants. And those kind of go hand in hand, right? That's why we looked at them. So the less precipitation you have, the less productivity you're going to have. So you're going to have very few plants and vegetation. Few. All right. So what that means is you're not going to have organics. They're going to not form very easily in those areas. However, we can also find these to exist in a place like the tropical rainforest. Now, why do we have very little O layer in tropical rainforest? This goes back to the fact that we have too much precipitation. So very high precipitation. And if you remember, the reason is that what happens is it starts to basically leach the soil. So it starts to run off. it goes down into the waterways, and then the soil loses it right away because of the amount of precipitation. Also, remember that plants have to grab it really, really quickly. So it's taken up fast. Excuse me, by plants. So it's like abundance of riches, right? You have too much, and then your soil is going to become depleted or poor. Okay, what about the ones that have lots of organic material? Okay, so let's go over here. So we have um, a, a deep, let's go with deep O layer. Which ones have deep O layers? Those are going to be places like prairies and temperate forests. Now, why do the prairies have a deep O layer? Mostly because they have seasonal rainfall, and then a little higher those temperature variations that happen. So see how this all ties back in with climate? We're all coming right back down to it. So seasonal rainfall can cause those plants to grow very quickly, and also they have very deep roots. So plants with deep roots. No room. All right, and the temperate rainforest, they're going to have a deep O layer. They do have high rain, right? So places like Seattle, they're going to have high rain, but it's going to have slower decomposition. And why does it have slow decomposition? Well, it does because it has low temps. Right, so it's not going to get warm, whereas in the tropical rainforest you're going to have that high decomposition happening because of the amount of decomposers that are there present in it. But here these low temps are going to keep those decomposers from being able to break the organics down very quickly. All right, so what about the A layer? All right, so A layer, here in North Texas, we have a high A layer. Our A layer is very, very deep, and the reason is that we are on the Blackland Prairie. Our actual soil name is called Houston Black. Don't know why. Houston Black. Now, Houston Black has a high muck. In other words, it is lots of clay. The clay percentage here is extremely high. And the reason is because of the foundation over time of the breakdown of those organics has just formed this really, really high layer of clay. Also, remember the parent rock has a lot to do with that as well. Now, this clay is great for growing stuff. In fact, the Blackland Prairie was high cotton country. Lots and lots of cotton was grown here. It's perfect for cotton. Unfortunately, it was also a great place to live, which means that we started to build on it pretty regularly. Believe it or not, the Blackland Prairie is one of the most endangered ecosystems in the entire world. There's not a lot of it present, and so anything that we've done to it, we have just overworked it and overworked it. So here we go. Clay. Let's talk about what clay soil does. One of the things about clay is that it is given to expansion and contraction. So if you were here, we would have done a lab where we would see how when you add water to clay, first of all, it takes a long, long time for it to permeate and to go through. The particles are so tiny that it takes just not enough airspace for that water to pour on through, where sand would be a lot. So what happens then is that clay begins to swell and expand when it gets wet. So it takes in a lot of water. It's got a high water holding capacity. High water holding capacity. So it's going to hold it in, which is fine if we had it rain all the time. And if you've ever been in the middle, when I say it's mucky, like your foot goes in when it gets wet and your shoes get stuck. It's not coming out, it's mucked. But in the summertime, when we have these seasonal rains and we end up with a dry spell, which we usually do in the summer, what happens is that clay, I'll just draw it for you real quick. The clay now begins to, so let's just say we've got our clay soil out here, right? And it swells. It gets really wet and it swells. Well, then summer comes, and what does it do? It starts to get cracks in it. So it's going to crack like this, and if you've ever been out in the yard in the middle of the summer, sometimes you'll see these deep cracks that will develop. So what the problem here is that it can do huge damage if you put a structure on top of it. So here we go. We've got, let's say that we decided we're going to build a house on top of it. So they come in and they kind of level it out. Let's level it out just a little bit. They take off part of it. And then they're going to put that house on top of it, right? So what are they going to do? They're going to come in and they're going to put a foundation on top of it, just like that. Okay, well, let's say that in the wintertime, we get enough rain and it starts to swell up underneath it, right? So you got your little house up under here. And everything's fine, but you'll start to notice that things start to shift. Your door closes when it shouldn't, opens when it shouldn't, and now you've got this shifting that starts to happen. Well, then here comes summertime, and what happens? All these cracks start to develop. So now we got these cracks up underneath the house. So this is why in the summertime it's really important that you keep your foundation watered. So we usually will run lines around the house to keep it watered. And what that does is it keeps the water from just keep going, the soil from expanding and contracting. So some of you who came from different areas may wonder, why in the world don't we have basements in the state of Texas? The reason is because of this clay soil. So what the clay does then is it expands and contracts, expands and contracts. If you had a basement up underneath here, what would happen? Let's say you put your basement in, right? I don't know if I can do this. Let's say you put your basement in right up underneath here. And then in the summer, it starts to contract. What it's going to do is it's going to leave a space all the way around that basement. And then when it rains in the wintertime, whoosh, that water comes right on in. And so they flood very easily. That's why we don't have them here. Okay, let's talk also. So we have a lot of clay here. The other thing that's important to know is that we are in Flower Mound is in an area known as the Cross Timbers. Now, if you go just east, just a little bit, you're going to find yourself in the Blackland Prairie. But here we're in the east, we're in the Cross Timbers. And that means that we have a lot of trees growing. Our natives are things like oaks and pecan and elm, hickory, those kinds of trees. Those would be the ones that grow naturally or natively around here. But let me tell you what they do. When they come in and put a house in Flower Mound, if you'll notice, the first thing they do is they come in and they basically scrape away all of the topsoil. All of that good Blackland Prairie, they just take that away. And now you're down If you look, you're down to like the almost the B layer. You're down this far in that house foundation, which means that you have now lost an extremely valuable part of your ecosystem, of your yard. So when they come in and they pull that away, guess what they do with it? They take it and they sell it. And they sell it back to you. They bag it up. They take it over to Living Earth. They amend it, make it all fancy and stuff. And then you can't grow anything in your brand new yard. They put grass up on top of it. It doesn't grow anything. So then you have to come back in and put your topsoil back on it. Aren't they smart? They made money twice off of you. Yes, they did. And here's the other thing they did. They took out all these natives. They pulled them all out, scraped them all off, right? And what they give you in exchange? Well, they gave you some things called Bradford pear, or they gave you a willow tree, or a maple. Those are pretty common that they'll come in and they'll plant those. And what these are fast growing trees. They grow very fast. So people get a lot of bang for their buck right away because they'll just grow really rapidly. But the problem is they're not really well suited for this area, and they start to break. They die pretty quickly, and so then you have to go back and replace them. And what do you want to replace them with? You want to replace them with the natives. But these trees grow really slowly, and people lose their patience for it. So this is how we kind of ended up where we are. Like, why everything looks exactly the same? Because home builders want to make it the same because it's cheaper and easier to do. I got a whole nother lecture about that, and we'll save it for later. All right, there is that. And we will continue with our the second part of our soils lecture next time. Bye.